Hello and welcome back to the deep dive. We are stepping right back into the virtual lecture hall today for another session of our ongoing course, Bodies, Systems, and Stories, a critical history of medicine.
It's good to be back.
If you've been with us for the long haul, you know we are methodically working our way through, well, the structural DNA of the modern medical world. And today we are marking our syllabus for Lecture 19.
And this is a big one. For anyone keeping track, we're making a pretty major pivot today. I mean, if you remember Lecture 17, we looked at the rise of the teaching hospital.
All right, the actual buildings, the institutions.
The brick and mortar. Then in Lecture 18, we went inside those walls to look at the grueling, sleep-deprived lives of the residents, the people who made the place run.
Exactly. We spent a lot of time on that clinical experience, the hierarchy, the hazing, the patient care, But today, Lecture 19, this is taking us in a very different direction.
It is.
We're looking at a massive shift that happened between, 1945 and 1965. The topic is the research imperative.
And this is, and I'm not exaggerating, this is the moment the modern medical school as we know it was really invented. We're going to analyze the transition from what historians call the educational era to the era of the multiversity.
Multiversity. That sounds huge and frankly a little impersonal.
It is, and that's the point. We're tracking a specific tension today, how the pursuit of scientific prestige, and specifically the sudden overwhelming flood of federal funding after World War II, fundamentally altered the soul of the medical school.
How so?
It changed it from a place that was, dedicated to teaching into a massive engine of research.
Okay, so to get us centered on that, I want to start by visualizing the opening slide of this lecture. It's slide 1. It offers this really stark visual metaphor.
It's a great one.
On the left side of the screen, there's a pre-war photograph. It shows a professor. He's at a bedside, surrounded by a gaggle of students. He's leaning in, maybe listening to a heart, or, palpating an abdomen. It feels intimate.
It does. It's clinical.
It's very human-focused.
That's the icon, really, of the clinician educator. The authority comes from, the laying on of hands.
And then you have this stark contrast on the right side. It's a post-war image. It's a researcher in a laboratory. He's not touching a patient. He's alone, or maybe with a technician, and he's surrounded by all this complex glassware, pipettes. Maybe there's an electron microscope looming in the background.
It's detached.
Very detached, technical. It's hyper-focused on the science, not the person.
And that, right there, is the hook for this entire deep dive. The lecture puts it this way. We are going to find out how we got from the doctor holding a hand to the doctor holding a pipette.
It's a powerful question. To understand that journey, though, we have to know where we started. We need to set the baseline. So let's look at slide 2, the pre-war baseline.
Right.
We're talking about what you called the educational era, which is roughly the period between World War I and World War II.
Exactly. This was the status quo of the 1920s and 30s. If you walked into a medical school in, say, 1930, maybe looking for a job or as a student, the primary mission of that institution was, it was strictly education.
That was it.
That was it. The faculty members viewed themselves, first and foremost, as teachers. Their job was to train the next generation of practitioners.
But surely they did some research. I mean, we had medical breakthroughs in the 20s and 30s.
Of course, research absolutely existed, but, and this is the critical distinction, it was a byproduct of teaching. It wasn't the main event.
A byproduct, that implies it's just something that happens on the side?
That's exactly right. It was often a hobby, a passion project. A professor might be curious about a specific physiological process or a strange case he saw in the ward, so in the evenings or on weekends, he'd go tinker in the lab.
And who paid for that?
He might pay for the equipment out of his own pocket,
Yeah.
or with small departmental funds. But here's the key. Nobody was breathing down his neck to publish. His job security did not depend on discovering a new molecule.
There is a really evocative phrase in the lecture notes that describes the atmosphere of this era. I love this. Threadbare gentility.
It captures the mood perfectly, doesn't it?
It really does. Let's unpack that. What does life look like in a state of threadbare gentility?
Well, threadbare tells you everything about the finances. Faculty salaries were low. I mean, really low. Medical schools were not wealthy institutions by any stretch. They were often struggling to make ends meet.
Okay, so that's the threadbare part. What about the gentility?
That refers to the social capital. The job security was incredibly high.
So you didn't make much money, but you were safe.
You were safe and you were respected. There was this deep sense of institutional loyalty. You joined a faculty, you knew your colleagues, you probably ate lunch together every day in the faculty club.
It sounds slower.
A much slower, more collegiate pace. You weren't racing against a clock or, a competitor at another university.
And structurally, how were these places funded? If they weren't swimming in cash, how did they keep the lights on?
It was what we call a hard money system. They relied on tuition from students, philanthropy from wealthy local donors, and state appropriations if they were a public school. The schools were small, financially modest, and relatively autonomous.
The key contrast here, looking at the notes, is really about what wasn't there.
Right. And what wasn't there was a massive federal pipeline of money. The U.S. government, back in the 1930s, was simply not in the business of funding medical schools. That was seen as a local or a private responsibility.
Okay, so that's the baseline, which brings us to the explosion. We're moving to slide 4, the engine of change, the rise of the NIH.
And this is the pivot point of the entire century for American medicine. We're looking at the post-World War II landscape. And explosion is absolutely the right word. We have a graph here showing the funding for the National Institutes of Health, the NIH.
Let's look at these numbers because they are just staggering. In 1947, the NIH budget was about $8 million.
A decent chunk of change, but nothing earth-shattering.
Right. But by 1966, it's $800 million.
That is a 100-fold increase in less than 20 years. That isn't just growth. That is a complete metamorphosis. You cannot pump that much money into a system without fundamentally changing its DNA.
What drove that? Why did the government suddenly decide to just open the floodgates?
You have to remember the context. We had just won World War II, and in the popular imagination, science had won the war.
Radar, the atomic bomb.
Exactly. The proximity fuse, and ultimately, the bomb. The Manhattan Project seemed to prove that if the federal government threw enough money and enough smart people at a problem, they could master the laws of physics.
And we can't forget penicillin. That came out of the war effort, too.
Absolutely. Penicillin had saved countless lives, so the public attitude just completely shifted. The logic became, we conquered the atom, surely we can conquer cancer if we just apply the same model.
A war on disease.
A war on disease. There was a massive political will for it.
The lecture notes mention a rebranding here that I think is really savvy. In 1948, the National Institute of Health singular became the National Institutes of Health plural.
It was a brilliant move, both organizationally and for marketing. Instead of having one big pot of money for biology, they organized research by disease category. You get the National Cancer Institute, the National Heart Institute, the National Institute of Mental Health, and so on.
And that makes it personal for the voters, for the politicians.
Precisely. It appealed directly to the public's fear of specific illnesses. It is much easier for a congressman to vote for funds to kill cancer than it is to vote for funds to, study cellular respiration.
And you had some key figures driving this, right? The notes mentioned someone named Mary Lasker.
Mary Lasker was a powerhouse lobbyist, an absolute force of nature. She, along with key allies in the Senate, effectively shamed the government into spending this money. The political climate was such that Congress routinely exceeded the budget requests the NIH actually made.
Wait, really? They gave them more money than they asked for?
All the time. The NIH would ask for X, and Congress would give them X plus 20%. They were practically shoveling cash into the furnace of medical research.
Wow. But there's a specific decision the NIH made that determined where all that money went. This is the extramural decision. This seems to be the crucial mechanism.
This is the detail that changed the university forever. The NIH had a choice. They could have decided to build a massive campus in Bethesda, Maryland, hire all the best scientists in the country, and do all this research in-house.
That would be intramural research.
Right, like the Manhattan Project. Keep it all in a bubble.
But they didn't do that.
No. They made the fateful decision to pursue an extramural strategy. They decided to dispense the money as grants to universities and medical schools all across the country.
So instead of the government doing the science, the government paid the medical schools to do the science for them.
Yes. And the implication of that one decision is profound. It effectively transformed medical schools into federal contractors. Overnight, they weren't just educational institutions anymore. They became the primary vendors for the federal government's massive new research agenda.
Which brings us directly to slide 5, because we have to talk about the economics of this. This wasn't just free money. It came with strings, and it created structural changes. We need to define soft money.
Right. We talked about hard money, earlier endowments, tuition, stable, internal money. Soft money refers to funds that are dependent on these renewable federal grants.
It's soft because it can go away.
Exactly. It's unstable. You have the money for 3 years, maybe 5, and then you have to reapply.
Yeah.
If you don't get the grant renewed, the money just vanishes.
That sounds incredibly stressful. Why would a university want to build its foundation on something that could just disappear in 3 years?
Because of the addiction. It was intoxicating. And it started with something called salary offsets. The NIH began allowing faculty members to charge a portion of their salaries directly to the grants.
Okay, walk me through that. How does that work?
So let's say I'm the dean of a medical school in 1950. I have a limited endowment. My hard money means I can only afford to hire, say, 10 professors. But now the NIH comes along and says, if you hire a researcher, we will pay 50% or even 75% of his salary through his grant.
Ah!
Suddenly my budget goes a lot further. I can hire way more faculty than my endowment could actually support, as long as they keep bringing in those grants.
That sounds like a great deal for the school in the short term. You get a bigger faculty for pennies on the dollar.
In the short term, yes, it was irresistible. But here is the real aha moment of slide 5, the thing that really turned research into a business model, and that's indirect costs, also known as overhead.
I feel like this is a term people outside of academia hear, but they don't really understand the sheer magnitude of it.
It's the secret engine of the modern university. It really is.
Hmm.
When a researcher asks for $100,000 to study a molecule, that's the direct cost money for test tubes, chemicals, a technician's salary, things like
The
that.
stuff for the actual experiment.
Right. But the university says, wait a minute, this research is happening in our building. We pay for the lights, the heating, the janitors, the library, the administration that has to process all the paperwork.
So the university basically acts like a landlord and charges a fee for using the space.
Exactly. And the government agreed to pay it. They added a percentage on top of the direct costs to cover these indirect costs. By the early 1960s, these overhead payments had risen to around 20%.
20% on top of every single grant.
Yes. And eventually, in later decades, they would go much, much higher. But even at 20%, the entire financial math changes.
Research ceased to be a financial drain on the school.
That's the key. In the 1930s, if a professor did research, it cost the school money. By the 1960s, research had become a revenue stream. The more research your faculty did, the more overhead checks the university collected to keep the lights on and pay the administrators.
So schools began to view research not just as this pure academic pursuit, but as a business model. You need those grants to keep the whole infrastructure solvent.
Precisely. And that financial imperative fundamentally changed who the faculty were, which takes us right to slide 7, the new faculty, the physician scientist.
We are seeing the rise of a completely new breed of doctor here, the physician scientist. How is this person different from the gentleman physician or the clinician educator of the pre-war era?
The pre-war clinician was an observer, almost a naturalist. They looked at symptoms, they categorized diseases, they were masters of the physical exam. Their expertise came from seeing thousands and thousands of patients.
Okay.
But the post-war clinical investigator was different. Their goal wasn't just to observe, it was to understand pathophysiology.
Pathophysiology, you mentioned that before, meaning the mechanism behind the disease.
Right. It's the difference between saying this patient has heart failure and needs digitalis versus asking, what is the biochemical pathway at the cellular level that is causing the heart muscle to fail in the first place?
And to answer that second question, you can't just be at the bedside holding a patient's hand.
No. You need a lab. You need controlled conditions. This era saw the rise of the Clinical Research Center. These were specialized units located right inside the hospital that effectively brought the laboratory to the patient.
The training for this must have been just incredibly demanding. I mean, you're asking someone to be a full doctor and a full scientist.
It was intense. You couldn't just get an MD anymore, not if you wanted to be a leader in this new system. You needed years of fellowship training in basic sciences. This is really when the dual degree norm takes off the MD PhD.
And the lecture notes point out a pretty significant shift in the hierarchy here, a change in status.
It was inevitable. This created a kind of caste system where scientific medicine based on lab data, on graphs, on mechanisms, was ranked higher than clinical medicine.
So the person actually treating the patient was seen as less important.
In a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The clinician who just took great care of patients was seen as merely empirical or observational. The real prestige, the real power, was now in the lab.
This leads perfectly into slide 8, the molecular turn. We're seeing a shift in focus that gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
It's a trajectory of reductionism. I mean, if you look at the broad history of medicine, we started with the whole person humors and temperaments. Then, with the birth of the clinic in Paris, we focused on the organ. Then Virchow gave us the cell. And in this era, we go all the way down to the molecule.
The visual reference for this slide is really telling. It contrasts a traditional anatomical drawing, muscles, bones, sinew, with an electron microscope image of a DNA helix.
That visual tells the entire story of the mid-20th century. The molecular turn meant that the frontier of medicine was no longer in the clinic or the anatomy lab, it was in biochemistry and genetics.
But this created a problem, which the lecture identifies as the bench-to-bedside gap.
Right.
Explain that gap for us.
Well, as research became more and more molecular, it also became more intellectually distant from the daily reality of caring for a sick human being.
How so?
Understanding the folding of a specific protein is scientifically vital. And I don't want to downplay that for a second.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily help you comfort a dying patient or manage a complex social situation on the ward or, diagnose a common rash.
The language changed, too. The schools even went so far as to rename their departments.
They did. Departments that used to be called preclinical, a term which implies they were just a warm-up for the real doctoring, were rebranded as basic science departments.
And that's not just semantics.
It's a huge signal. It signaled that their allegiance was now to the discipline of biology, not necessarily to the practice of medicine. Their audience was other scientists, not future doctors.
So we have all this money, all this prestige, all this new science. It sounds great on paper, but everything has a cost. And that brings us to slide 10, the cost's devaluation of teaching.
This is where the rubber really meets the road for the students. We entered the era of publish or perish.
That's a phrase we hear all the time now. It's almost a cliche, but this is the moment it was born.
It became the iron law of academia. Promotion and tenure, the keys to a successful academic career, were now tied strictly to your research productivity. How many grants did you bring in? How many papers did you publish in high-impact journals?
Then what about teaching? Where did that fit in?
Teaching became a liability. Honestly, if you spent too much time preparing lectures or mentoring medical students, you weren't writing grants. You weren't in the lab.
There's a cartoon described in the slide. A professor running past a student to get to the lab. It's funny, but it's also kind of tragic.
It reflects the reality of the absentee professor. The senior faculty, the men, and they were almost all men with most knowledge and experience, were too busy writing grants and running labs to teach. So who ended up teaching the students?
The residents, I assume, the junior staff.
Exactly. They delegated teaching down the chain. And this created what the lecture calls the hidden curriculum. We've touched on this concept in previous episodes, but it's really important here.
The hidden curriculum is the lesson you learn that isn't on the syllabus. It's what you learn by just watching how the system actually works.
And in this system, students learned very quickly that research was the currency of value. Patient care and teaching were secondary. If you wanted to be a god in the hospital, you had to be a researcher.
So education shifted from being the central mission
to being a byproduct of the research enterprise. A complete inversion of the pre-war model.
That is a heavy shift. And it didn't just change the students' experience, it changed the lives of the professors, too. Slide 11 talks about the decline of academic gentility.
Right, remember that threadbare gentility we started with? The low-stress, loyal, collegial atmosphere.
Gone.
That was completely gone. It was replaced by the treadmill.
The treadmill, that just sounds exhausting.
It was, and it is. Because you were relying on soft money, you had to constantly hustle. You had to write grant after grant just to pay your own salary and the salaries of your lab technicians and postdocs.
So your job security wasn't about being a good citizen of the university anymore?
No. It was tied directly to your funding stream. The ethos became, you eat what you kill.
And this changed where the professor's loyalty lay. The notes talk about the rise of the cosmopolitan professor. This is a sociological term, right?
Yes. In sociology, you distinguish between locals and cosmopolitans. Locals are people whose primary reference group is their immediate community. Cosmopolitans are people whose reference group is the wider world, their professional peers.
So in the past, a professor was a local.
Right. Their loyalty was to their school, to Harvard or Penn or Michigan. They cared about campus politics, about their students. But the new cosmopolitan professor, Their loyalty was to their federal granting agency, the NIH, and to their national discipline.
They cared more about what the grant review board in Bethesda thought of them than what their own dean thought.
Absolutely. So they became jet setters.
Always flying off to conferences.
Exactly. Presenting data, networking to ensure their next grant, sitting on study sections. They were rarely on campus. The university just became a kind of holding company where their lab happened to be parked.
And the atmosphere within the school changed from that family vibe to what the slide calls a culture of competition.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if your survival depends on getting a slice of the federal pie and your colleague down the hall is trying to get the very same slice, things get competitive.
Fiercely competitive.
Fierce battles erupted over lab space, over grant dollars, over everything. I need more square footage for my electron microscope. Well, I need it for my centrifuge. The collegiality just eroded.
It sounds like the mission of the medical school itself was really getting warped. And slide 12 calls this distortion of mission. There's a quote here from Milton Eisenhower.
Yes, the president of Johns Hopkins University at the time, and of course the brother of President Dwight Eisenhower. He gave this very famous, very prescient warning. He said, "The system of project grants is pulling us unconsciously in an undesirable direction."
What does he mean by unconsciously?
He meant that schools weren't sitting down and strategically planning their future based on actual health needs. They weren't asking, what does our community need? Or what are the most important educational goals? They were grant chasing.
Just following the money.
Just following the money. Research priorities were no longer set by local health needs or even by pure intellectual curiosity. They were set by what the NIH would fund. If the NIH put out a call for cardiovascular research, suddenly everyone became a cardiovascular researcher.
And this led to what the lecture calls opportunistic growth.
Right. Schools added programs. They built entire new wings on their hospitals. They hired legions of staff simply because money was available for those specific things.
Not because it fit into a coherent plan.
Not at all. And it led to these bloated, unmanageable organizations, the multiversity. They became these massive, sprawling complexes with no central unifying educational mission. Just a collection of independent, grant-funded contractors all operating under one roof.
It really sounds like a bubble. You have this period of rapid expansion, a huge influx of cash, and this total reliance on a single source of income. And as we know from history, bubbles tend to burst.
They do.
And that takes us to slide 14, the coming storm, the age of limits.
The party couldn't last forever. We're moving into the late 1960s now, and the visual on this slide is a storm cloud gathering over the NIH building in Bethesda.
What caused the slowdown? What bricked the bubble?
Two major factors collided: the Vietnam War and economic inflation. The war was draining the federal budget at an alarming rate. And at the same time, inflation was eroding the value of the dollar. The double-digit growth of the NIH budget that had characterized the 50s and early 60s suddenly just slowed to a crawl.
And for schools that had become totally addicted to that soft money, this must have been a moment of sheer panic.
It revealed their incredible vulnerability. Schools that had built massive infrastructures, 10-story research towers, armies of technicians entirely on soft money, suddenly realized they had lost control of their own financial destiny.
Because if the federal tap turned off, or even just slowed down,
They couldn't pay their staff, they couldn't heat the buildings, they had built a machine they could no longer afford to fuel.
and this forces the next pivot, which is a teaser, I guess, for where the course goes in future lectures. If the research money starts to dry up, where do these schools turn for revenue?
They need a new cash cow.
What is it?
They turn to the only other source of massive revenue available to them: high-volume clinical practice. They start ramping up, seeing patients, doing procedures, billing insurance companies for everything they can.
And that sets the stage for the whole era of managed care.
Exactly. The pressure shifts from get more grants to see more patients, but that's a story for another day.
So let's wrap this up with the conclusion on slide 15. The visual is a balance scale.
It's a scale, and it's tipped heavily toward research. And education and service are left high up in the air, completely outweigh.
Summarize this for us then. The research imperative, ultimately, was it good or bad?
It's a classic double-edged sword. I mean, on one hand, we cannot deny the incredible benefits. This era produced the antibiotics, the cancer treatments, the fundamental biological knowledge that we all rely on today. It was a golden age of discovery. It made American medicine the scientific envy of the world.
But the cost?
The cost was the marginalization of the medical student and the fragmentation of the academic community. We built this machine that was incredible at producing data and publishing papers, but it often forgot its fundamental duty to produce caregivers.
The provocative thought to end on here is really striking. We built a system designed to treat molecules and publish papers. Did we forget to build a system that treats people?
That is the question that haunts modern medicine. When the entire incentive structure is built around the molecule, around the grant, the paper, the overhead check, the person, both the student and the patient, can get lost in the shuffle.
And speaking of people getting lost, or in some cases being deliberately excluded, next time we're going to look at the shadow side of this golden age. While all this funding was booming and the labs were expanding, who was left standing outside the gates?
That's right. Next time, in Lecture 20, we're going to be discussing exclusion and gatekeeping, race in medical education. We're going to look at the people this new, powerful system was specifically designed to keep out.
It's going to be a really important and, I think, difficult conversation. So thank you all for listening to this deep dive into the research imperative. We will see you back here for Lecture 20.
Goodbye, everyone.